So hello everyone and welcome. Fáilte. I want to thank Athlone Castle for hosting me today, and to the Heritage Council and their arm, the Irish Wall Towns Network, for supporting this event today, which will end up eventually being part of our Heritage Week celebrations in 2022. Today's talk is all about the Vikings and the Normans. I've decided to concentrate on the 10th century onwards up to around the invasion of the Normans, which happened in 1169. And so that covers a lot. I mean, we're talking about the earliest Viking raid being 795. And then you have the establishment of towns like Dublin, Limerick, Waterford, all happening from 840-41 onwards. A lot of important cities in Ireland founded by them, especially on the east and the south coast. And then we're looking at major battles of the Viking Age, like the 980s, the Battle of Tara, one of the last attempts by the Vikings really to wrest control from the Southern O'Neill, which I'm sure everyone in Westmeath is very proud of that heritage. And then you have the Battle of Clontarf, probably more famous, and that was fought in 1014, so that's the early 11th century. After the Battle of Clontarf, of course, the Vikings' power wasn't completely broken. It wasn't really about that. It was more factional, more nuanced than all that stuff. And eventually you have the invasion of Ireland by the Normans as allies of the King of Leinster, as also part of that politics, led by Strongbow, but other famous Normans were also involved, of course, such as later on you'd have the de Burgos, who established themselves in Connacht. So we'll have a look at some of the stuff through the medium of reproductions. There's no original items here today. Everything here is a museum, hopefully level reproduction. But the originals, if you want to see them, we have a very good collection in the museum on Kildare Street in Dublin. That's the main repository to see Viking Age and Norman stuff. It's in the upstairs wing there, and it's free, which is one of the few free things you'll get in Dublin these days, as you may know. I'm just going to look at some of the weapons, and we might do a full sweep here. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. We might get through everything, or we might divide it up, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to talk about what's on the ground first. So on the ground we have a collection of weapons, including sword. There's 3 spears there, and a collection of 4 axes. So just thought I'd explain to you the nuance and the differences between these weapons as time goes on. All of these weapons, swords, axes, spears, are often found as pagan Viking grave goods in the 9th and 10th centuries in Ireland, most particularly in the Claíomh and Island Bridge excavations, from the 19th century. But we found other ones more recently as well. And as I say, there can be a combination of these weapons. You can have the sword with the spear, you can have the sword with the axe, or you can have all 3 in some cases. It just depends, Also, as I said, knives are often found in Viking graves. Just had the knife arranged here with a piece of jet. The jet is worn as a pendant, a bit like the sandstone from the woman here earlier on. And the jet was an alternative way of sharpening the blade. So you wouldn't do it the Hollywood way. you do it that way. And the jet, of course, it's a bit of status in itself as well. Everything is status, though, in this period. It really is. It's a very superficial thing in some ways. But that's life, and it's important. It keeps the pecker up, I guess, during those bad days. And as I said earlier on, often the handle will be longer than the blade itself. This is actually the knife I normally use for my own craft work. It's very effective, very sharp, and I do use the sandstone and the jet to sharpen them. And the sheath here is based on the original one from Dublin. So we've a lot of leather work from around the High Street area, in particular from the excavations in Dublin. But we have leather work from other parts of Ireland too. And as I said, the handle, nearly the whole grip, is kept in place within the sheath, which is a bit foreign to our eyes now. We're often used to see the whole handle sticking out and only the blade is covered. And you have that simple herringbone pattern there, and some simple depressed patterning going on there. And that's about as elaborate as these Viking knives go for their sheaths. Norman knife sheaths actually are a lot more elaborate for some reasons. That's one of the artefacts in the Norman period I actually prefer. They're much more artistic. But in most areas, the Vikings are extremely artistic. Or at least that's what we're finding anyway. So this one could be suspended from the belt, as I said, especially in the 9th century. But in the 10th century, there's more of a trend, it appears, from what we're seeing in the graves. And it's borne out by the saga evidence, by the way, that the knife was worn around the neck quite a lot at that time. This handle here, by the way, is just ash wood, which, of course, is in a bit of danger with the disease that's going on now. But it looks like iron's been less effective from what we're seeing so far. So let's hope it keeps up. It's mainly young trees being affected. The older ones seem to be riding us out quite well so far. Okay, so that's your basic thing. As I say, these are not weapons. These are a utility knife, really, that you might use for carving a rune, or you might use for having your dinner with. There's no forks, of course, so it's your left hand maybe, and one of these for your dinner implements. Talking of runes, by the way, in wood, we always think of the runes, don't we, in stone, because that's how they survive. They don't normally survive in wood. However, there is, I think from Bergen in Norway, there's price tags literally carved out. There's a knife, so they're made of wood. So that's kind of cool, isn't it? I think very modern sort of thing, isn't it, in a way? And there's also saga evidence from, do you know Gisli saga? It's it's not one of those famous ones like Njal or Ale or Lochstella, but it's on the second tier there. And Gisli saga has a story where a man comes, to his, I think it's his brother's house. The guy's not in, so he carves a message, throws it through the window, text message, from the Viking age, that's how it works. So interesting stuff. Again, you have a Viborg type tunic down there and a wool tunic underneath it. Wool tunics would have been worn as well, just to keep warm. From the literature evidence, it appears that tunics didn't go longer than the knee for the Vikings. That was again another case of, that's a bit too, effeminate maybe for their tastes at that time. Whereas the Normans, a bit different. You often see Strongbow, Miles de Cogan, all these other Normans with quite long gowns on, probably a bit of opulence been shown there. And obviously, if you're wearing a long gown, you can hitch it on the belt, so you can always hitch it up, which is how the Gaelic lena of the 16th century was also worn. So that's that for you. I'll just show you some other weapons now. We'll look at the spears, I think. So I'll bring these forward. Spear length is a bit difficult because the wood doesn't always survive, but sometimes you can discern variations in the soil that indicate spear length. And the odd time, such as at Lendbreen in Norway, when the ice receded in the 70s, all this global warming stuff is usually a catastrophe, but that's one small benefit, is that we get to see an intact Viking spear. And the lengths appear to be for war spears somewhere between 2 meters for a thrusting spear. The Lendbreen one about 2.5 is probably a little bit below average. And there's even spears recorded in Poland during the Viking Age that are upwards of 3 meters. So it's almost half the length of a pike, a really long weapon. So spear lengths, as I say, we don't know all that much about them, but that's a rule of thumb, maybe 2.5, 2.7 meters for a typical thrusting spear. This is the most common type found in Ireland and in most other Viking areas. They range in size colossally. There's some that are 70 centimeters long. There's some that are very, very short, almost like an arrow. They're quite delicate looking. Usually there's a finial in the center, little rise there in the metal to give strength for the thrust. Very important, and a very acute point at the top. They're often quite narrow, the Viking spears are, for making the thrust, and often they're shouldered. They're not usually a diamond shape per se. What we're seeing is more of an asymmetrical diamond, I suppose, is the way you would put it. There's other variations too. This is only one type of Viking spear, but as I say, it's the most common one. Some are more leaf-shaped, for example. The deep socket is really what tells us that this one is a thrusting spear. It's quite robust. It's going to last a while. And obviously, if you're entering a combat situation in hand-to-hand combat, or melee as we call it, you're hoping this is the only weapon you have to use. You don't want to have to resort to the sword on your belt. If you can get the job done with this one, crack the other side, break them up psychologically early on, that's the way to do it. The haft is ash, and interesting about spears, in the Norse sources, spears are often just referred to as ashes. So that shows how common ash was as a wood of choice for spear shafts. Like ourselves today, you would often oil the wood to preserve it with beeswax, or you could use linseed oil, which was used to maintain the weapon. So another type of spear, much more rare in Ireland, but known in the Viking Age, mainly from the Frankish Empire, that is to say Germany and modern France. These spears seem to be common in the early Viking Age, whereas the one we saw is known as Peterson Type F. If you follow this, you're doing well. This one's Type B. And the Type B is characterized by having wings on the socket. It also often has this decorative feature of incisions or hollows running parallel with the blade itself. And the blade is more rounded, more of a leaf-shaped blade. These are often pattern welded, which is to say they were made of rods of iron which were hammered out, and then a steel edge would have been hammer welded to the core. So it's quite like an elaborate sword in the way it's made, It would have had a softer centre, giving a bit of spring to it, a bit of elasticity that's needed for shock. And then you have the sharp edge, the hard sharp edge. So an amazing weapon. These are probably first developed for hunting. They could have been, this could have stopped the blade from going in too deep if you're hunting a deer, or especially a boar. That, of course, could be very dangerous in its last few seconds of life. You need to be able to withdraw that weapon to protect yourself. So that's one possibility anyway. But they seem to have been used in warfare as well, to some degree, although they may not have been purposely designed for it. And one particular thing that you could do, is it's very difficult to show, but you can open up a shield, possibly by using the wing, and maybe expose, the person behind. That's a possibility, and maybe we'll show you that as a display in the future. The base of this spear also has, it's kind of weaponized, you might say, mightn't you? It's a ferrule, and we've got quite a few of these in the National Museum in Dublin as well, associated with spears. It's basically a cone of metal that caps the butt of the spear. And I can imagine if I was in a fix like Clontarf, which lasted 12 hours, by the way, long shift to be doing in such a battle. No trade unions in those days. You can go that way, yes, of course. But if someone's come behind you, that would be, an emergency weapon, if nothing else. It was also probably designed, though, for hostings. You're never going to put the blade of any weapon into the ground, as they sometimes do in films. Why? But what you could do is you could ground it with this, and maybe that's a purpose to have this, It makes me also think that the spears that didn't have these ferules may have been pointed anyway at the far end. Why not, So that's the two main war spears I have today to show you. And both of them I would classify as thrusting spears on account of these deep sockets. Conversely, by the way, the Type F spear sometimes had filed in groove decoration going horizontal to the spearhead, by the way. But this one is quite plain. But you do get that as well at times. So quite different, the two spears. This is probably a Scandinavian speciality, made in the Viking homelands, etc. Probably in important places like Dublin also. Whereas this one is, a Frankish weapon that has been utilised by the Vikings in the early period, and it seems to die out really later on in the 10th, 11th century. But there is boar spears, as they're called, in medieval times that also have wings, which have a similar purpose. Some of the wings are very wide at that stage, by the way, so they're unsubtle. This one here is a very unusual looking one, and if you remember the arrows earlier on, we had some arrows that had a double blade. Well, this spear, it's not even in Peterson's typology, because as far as we know, it's unique. I think the original one was found in Offaly, County Offaly. It's been ascribed the Viking age date, I think simply because of its morphology, because of its shape, because it looks a bit like the arrowheads at the time. Very small socket. When we made this replica, we didn't, make the socket bigger, which might have been a bit more convenient and easier to assemble. We kept it shallow. So I think this is basically a disposable weapon in some ways. It's a weapon that you would throw, and you're not going to be relying on that as a thrusting weapon, I don't think, unless you really had to. And again, it could be a hunting tool as well. The Irish and the Vikings, didn't use the bow that much, and javelins and darts, hand thrown, with an effective range of 25 meters, maybe 20 meters, 30 meters, would have been quite common. So it could have been a hunting weapon also. And so we just don't know really, It's one of those mysterious things that could have been both weapon and hunting tool, but it's very iconic looking. And because it was, in a way, I like to show the typical stuff, but sometimes it's nice just to see something that's really, really unusual, that has no parallel, as far as I know, in any Viking country during the whole period. So interesting thing. And three blades, why three blades when you could just do the same job with two, right? Well, interesting stuff to talk about, Maybe someone's going to write a paper about it someday, not me. So that's the spears. I think we should move on to axes now. We'll get to the swords, don't worry. When we think of the Viking Age, we think of, I was going to say horned helmets. We think of ships, I think, is one thing. That's one of the most iconic things about the Viking Age, isn't it? Shiploads of, violent guys with bad tempers, 7 days rowing, big biceps, great gym workout, all that stuff. We think about that, But we also think about axes. And prior to the Viking Age, we know the Irish used swords. You go to Legor Crannog, fantastic swords were used. They're on a smaller scale to the Viking swords, but they were used. Spears have been used in Ireland since day dot. Now, axes were possibly used in the Bronze Age as weapons, but there's no evidence in the very early medieval era that the Irish used axes at all. But it's a complete, Saul on the road to Damascus situation. During the Viking Age, the Irish take to the axes very readily very early it seems. And by the time the Normans come to Ireland, the Normans even saved the Irish that they're very welcoming with the axe, you know. So there you go. You can read into that what you will. So I'm just going to show you. I didn't bring an early axe, but I brought a single-handed axe, just one single-handed axe, just to show you how small they could be. Cutting edge is like less than 10 centimeters. Its morphology is basically a triangle, and that's what you're seeing with Viking axes at the time. At the back, you could double up as a tool. You've got a little hammer surface there that you could use for putting nails back into your shield, whatever you need to do. The head was made of iron, but usually the edge was usually made of carbon steel that was hammer welded to the head overall. The haft, again, often ash was used, although we've seen other woods used for axe hafts in Ireland, such as cherry wood. There's not very many that have preserved hafts, by the way, but some from the Claíomh, for example, have cherry wood, to the best of my memory. There's a couple of ears there. These ears look nice. They're a nice thing to look at, but they're also designed for when you're fitting the axe head. You can tap those in a bit with your hammer, and that clenches the haft all the better. Some of these axes, of course, would have also had a wedge at the top also to hold the head in. The socket of the axe, as you can see, is very long and very narrow. So it wasn't like your shovel handle, you know, a lot of the time. The haft probably corresponded to that shape all the way. And of course, when you go to woodies, it's all well and good. You can get a straight one always, but you might get a bit of curvature there that you get used to, and that's maybe a useful thing in some ways, you know. So this weapon here, I would suggest, is not a favourite of Hollywood. They want to see a big, huge, probably made of foam, painted black, dry brush silver axe head. But in reality, the Viking wants an efficient weapon that works. And this is it. This is quick. It's not very costly. You can buy probably 15 of these for the price of one sword. So fantastic weapon. It does massive damage. You can have a long haft in this, 2 foot, 2.5 foot. And that small, short cutting edge, that's what you want, to do a deep, deep cut that's going to really, end someone's career that day. So fantastic weapon. And the beauty of the single-handed axe, these smaller axes, is that they could be used with the shield. So you have the shield in the left hand, you got the axe in the right hand. But, however, there is heavier axes appearing in the Viking Age as we move on. And these axes are double-handed, some of them. I'll just put my clip back in again, my Viking clip. We'll get there eventually, won't we? I'll stick it. Okay, I'll stick it in here. You don't like that? Okay. Okay, so I brought 3 double-handed axes here today, and you can regard some of this as bonus material. We're meant to be talking about Vikings and Normans, but there's a bit of bonus material here. In the Old Norse, breedox. Breedox is, to us, it's broad axe, and the broad refers to the cutting edge being broad. And you can see the steel edge there and the iron head. You got those ears as we had the earlier one. You got the wooden wedge at the top there to keep the head in shape. All the hafts here are ash, by the way. So when does this come in? Well, we think it's around the 11th century. By the time of the Battle of Hastings in England, it's common. It's the main weapon used by the Anglo-Danish huscarls, who were the main, full-timer soldiers employed by the Saxon kings in the early 11th century. That's their main weapon. The sword is secondary to this weapon. Of course, because it's two-handed, you can't use a shield with it, so it's a quite ruthless weapon in many regards. But certainly it's going to cause colossal damage. Whoever takes a hit from this is a goner, I would suggest. Was it early enough for Clontarf? We don't know for sure, but it's quite likely. Yeah, I think 1 or 2 of these might have been around the Battle of Clontarf. Broder, who was the leader of the Manx Vikings, the Battle of Clontarf, who actually killed Brian Boru at the end of the day, as most of the Vikings were routing, he may have used an axe just like this to kill the king. The king, as far as we know, took a blow to the clavicle and was cut right down to his hip, and that's what killed him. The mythology, of course, tells us when the blood spurted out that a boy that lost his arm in the same blow, his arm grew back because of the sacred kingly blood. But that's Brian Boru, age 73, in his tent at Clontarf. You can't really blame him, can you? Although it's regarded as an Irish victory, the losses to Ireland that day were so great that really, it might have been a strategic victory in terms of the next 10 years, but it was really a draw really between the two sides, and tough day for everyone involved. The haft there is made of ash. Now the length of the haft, it's about armpit height, okay? So rule of thumb there, armpit height's good. That's what we're seeing on the Bayeux Tapestry, for example, about armpit height. And any of the hafts we have in Ireland that survived, they're not longer than armpit height, let's put it that way. And we don't see iconography of longer hafts anywhere. Reenactors sometimes will use a longer haft because they want to, tip that guy who's over there. But we're talking about history here, we're talking about archaeology here, and this is what you're dealing with. This is what we're seeing in the evidence. And if I was in charge of the world's reenactment, if I was the Führer of all that stuff, I wouldn't allow anyone to have one longer than their armpit height, you know. That's the way I'd be going with it, you know. But that's just me. What do I know? And maybe I'm wrong. And maybe all those, you know, 8 foot, 7 foot, 6 foot hats just weren't recorded, you know. So the bredock's very important. Peterson has a type name for these. They're known as Type M. They're probably the best known ones because they're the ones, you know, that everyone thinks of, the big axe that Hollywood loves the Vikings to have. But as I say, the early Viking raiders wouldn't have had these. It doesn't exist till, you know, 11th century really. The ones in the 11th century tend to be very elegant. Some of the best ones are preserved in the Museum of London. Not the British Museum, the Museum of London, that smaller museum. They got a few really nice ones from the Thames. In the 12th century, the type of axe still continues. It's still basically triangular in shape, like our small hand axe. But this bit here is a bit wider, a little bit more crude looking 12th century. Now, this is when our Irish typology of axes begins. These are known as Type 1 in Ireland, and they're 12th century, roughly, yeah. And this is the sort of axe that our Irishman is welcoming the Norman in with, you know. And even Hugh de Lacy, one of the most famous Normans, you know, County Meath, he was killed with one of these, for example, by an Irishman, you know. So that's how it goes down sometimes. Now, Ireland's unusual insofar as most European countries, axes were gone. You get bills coming in later, you get halberds, you get all sorts of other weapons, but you don't get axes in this kind of a way developing from the Viking axe, really. But in Ireland, we have our Type 2 axe and our Type 3 axe. Now, these axes they're very hard to date. Both types are found in riverine finds only, and so far we've only found 2 of these. And we found a few more of these, but they differ in their size. Generally, these ones have curved edges. Generally, these ones have straight edges or nearly straight edges. Maybe not quite straight, but nearly straight. These ones have a very wide body here near the haft, just like the Type 12, but even wider than that. These ones tend to be quite narrow here. Both of them have very small sockets, always very small, so it's a very thin socket. Maybe, you know, these weapons didn't last too long in a combat situation, or maybe speed was more important than robustness, or maybe they did last, you know. It just depends what you're doing and do you know how to use it properly. That's another question, isn't it? So we don't know as much as we'd like to know. Earliest date for both types is 13th century, you know, so 1200s, you know. Latest date is 16th century. In fact, there seems to be English accounts describing this axe, for example, as sharp as a shoemaker's knife in 1543, for example. I think it's Barnaby Rich who talks about this axe, and he compares it to the axe of the Tower. He's referring to, you know, the axemen who guarded, you know, the beefeaters of the Tower of London today. And those old axes also had a similar curved edge rather than the straight edge you see here. The earliest ones of these axes were found in an antique shop by museum director Adolf Marr in the 30s, I think. And since those days, we found more of them, and some of them are quite long. Some of them have a cutting edge that's actually a foot long. So about that length altogether. 3 of them were found in the Blackwater between counties Armagh and Tyrone, for example. One of them decorated with silver. The silver ones are used by officers who were known as constables, in charge of ostensibly about 80 other men. And also, we think that possibly silver axes were used by those gallowglasses who served singly as bodyguards. And even Lord Mountjoy, at the Battle of Kinsale in 1601, apparently had a gallowglass as his personal bodyguard. All his troops are English, nearly all of them are English. A couple of people from the Pale and Dublin and all that stuff. But his bodyguard was actually a Gaelic gallowglass. It's interesting stuff that even he kept that tradition going, you know. So sometimes for that reason, because of their association with gallowglasses, these axes are called gallowglass axes, which is incorrect because we don't know. I mean, yes, they're spart axes. The Irish word for these ones is cúil crumma, crooked back axe, because it has this convex upper horn rather than this one, which is concave, more like a Viking one. Maybe this one's earlier because it's a bit more like the Viking one. Maybe this one's a bit later, but we just don't know, because when you find these in the bottom of a river, in the alluvial soil there, you just don't have that stratigraphy. You don't have the context for it, you know. So the jury's out, and it's an interesting mystery. But for now, we have a lot of morphology, we could say, from the 13th right to the 16th with these axes, which is fantastic in some respects. English sources do call them spart axes, by the way, and spart axe is a fairly safe term for both types. We don't think the gallo glasses used these ones. These were probably gone by even the earliest days of the gallo glasses, which is from 1260 onwards, by the way, in case you're wondering. Why are the gallo glasses important? Well, they dominate Irish warfare in the 13th and especially the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries in Ireland, right till, you know, the popularisation of firearms and even beyond that for some time. They're also given the credit by historian Brendan Smith, for example, of being one of the main factors that held back the Anglo-Norman tide. The Anglo-Normans never took over the whole country. They got about as far as half of the country altogether. And that's largely down to the employment by Irish chiefs of these warriors who are of Scandinavian, mixed Highland, Scottish, Gaelic blood. These guys are one of the main mitigating factors stopping Normans conquering the whole country. Very interesting warriors to study, but maybe I'll come back to Athlone another day and we'll just talk about gallo glasses. But I just thought I'd introduce you to the axe morphology. It's an interesting thing anyway, and as I say, in Ireland, what I'm talking about when I say type 1, Irish type 1, Irish type 2, Irish type 3, all devised by Andrew Halpin back in the day, this is an Irish typology that we don't have anywhere else. It's just particular to this country. Okay, that's the axes for you. I will say also that axes in general are the most devastating weapon against armour for obvious reasons. So maybe armour was getting heavier in the 11th century, and that was the cause, one of the causes of why they had to have, you know, these heavier weapons, because obviously it came at a great price when you can't bear a shield. One of the best stories in the Viking Age of these axes being used happened in the 11th century. The Battle of Hastings is the most famous battle of 1066. I'm sure you all know of it and know a bit about it even maybe. But there was another battle fought that year in the north of England when the Norwegian army also invaded just before Hastings, just about 2 or 3 weeks before that, or maybe a month before. And the battle that culminated, the big one, was the Battle of Stamford Bridge. The leader of the Norwegians was a guy called Harald Hardrada. Harald Hardrada is one of the most famous Vikings of the Viking Age. There's a great physical description of him in the Heimskringla, in the sources. But apparently on the day of the battle, the Vikings had already had some success in the north. The city of York was largely well disposed towards the Norwegians. You know, Norwegians sounds better to me than Saxons, you know, that works for me. So they didn't have too much policing to do, it seems. And their army, they knew that the big army in the south, you know, the London-based army, was going to come up at some stage under Harold Godwinson. But when? Not sure. But it's going to take a while, obviously. They're all on foot, these English, you know. It's going to take some time. So on the day of the battle itself, apparently the Vikings were out sunbathing, relaxing. No armour, no clothes in some cases probably, you know. And they could see in the distance, according to the Norwegian account, the shimmering of spears and mail and helmets. What the hell? Almost too late, you know. And there was a small bridge, as you might imagine, from a battle with that sort of a name. And one of the Vikings, he's unnamed. He's not even mentioned in the Viking sources. This is the interesting thing about him. No name for him at all in the Viking sources. Not even mentioned what he does. But in the English sources, and this is why we know it's true, he is mentioned. And they just call him the Nameless Norwegian. This guy stands at this bridge. The English army's coming up. And obviously they're going, look, back off, man. He doesn't back off. So cut a long story short, the body count gets pretty high pretty soon. It's 30 dead bodies in front of this one Norwegian guy wielding one of these. Incredible stuff, absolutely incredible, you know. And some of those guys are probably Harold Godwinson's best men, you know, the Saxon king. In the end, the English had to resort to skullduggery to take care of this situation. They put a raft together, a couple of men go underneath the bridge and use spears from underneath while he's distracted maybe with someone who's in front of him. But at the end of the day, this guy, he killed 40 guys altogether of the English army. Incredible body count when you think about it. All done apparently with a breed axe, with a broad axe, a Peterson Type M if you prefer. Incredible story. And it allowed the Vikings a bit of time to get on the gear that they had with them. It allowed Harald Hardrada to send back a guy called Eystein Ori back to his ships to try and, you know, get some more gear from the ships. But by the time Eystein Ori had got back to the battle, it was too late. And the Norwegians had lost, not before. There was a furious battle, by the way. Those losses, by the way, at Stamford Bridge would have been telling, I think, at the Battle of Hastings later on. A lot of Harold's best men were lost at Stamford Bridge, defeating the Norwegians. And Harold Godwinson is probably one of the best military leaders England ever had, you know. The march he did up to the north, his march back down again, keeping that army cohesive. Hastings is a near run thing if you read about it. Close enough a thing, you know. It just goes to show, you know. Battle's very chancy things, you know. Very chancy. Harold Hardrada, by the way, for record, apparently in a blind fury in his last few seconds of life, wielded his sword two-handed in a blind white rage, you know. hacking him, and then took an arrow in the eye, went down. So that's the way to die if you're a Norwegian king, in battle. So his chainmail, by the way, was long. Usually the Vikings, when they wore mail, this is a nice segue into the mail, isn't it? Yeah. Usually the Vikings, when they wore mail, is quite short. We don't think it was that common. So I'm going to give you an estimation. There's maybe 70 men on a 32-oar boat, maybe 70, double the crew, a few extras. Of them, maybe one has mail, maybe 5 have mail. It's rare. There's not a lot of it, At the Battle of Clontarf, we're told, though, that the Orkney men, under the leadership of Sigurd Hlodvisson, Sigurd of Orkney, the Earl of Orkney, the Earl of Orkney, he had 1,000 men, all armed in mail. Now, that's what the O'Brien propaganda of the 12th century tells us, but maybe there's a bit of truth in it, who knows, because he singles those out for having mail, So sometimes mail might have been quite common. But where it does appear, the archaeological evidence, and it's very scanty. Jomumbu is probably the best example in Norway. The mail shirt is like a t-shirt, short arms, and very short in the skirt, very short in the skirt, shorter than I'd like it to be, let's put it that way. Not going to go into any more detail, Even so, it would have been quite a weight, about 8 kilos of weight, so wearing mail is a big deal, It's always a trade-off between comfort and protection, of course. The Normans would have had longer mail shirts. And I think Harald Hardrada's one, his mail shirt is mentioned as being long, and it's even given a name of Emma, female name, maybe out of respect for its length, This is the sort of shirt that Hardrada might have had, and the sort of shirt that maybe some of the leading Normans may have had, although by the time we get to the Norman period, these hauberks, as they're known, had mail mufflers as well, integral to them. A muffler is basically a glove of mail, integral to the sleeve of mail, all attached. This would have gone down to your knee. They also, the Normans, that is, would have used coifs. Now, sometimes the coif, we just don't have enough of this armour extant, to be perfectly honest with you. And it's suggested that some of these coifs might have been integral as well to the hauberk, The whole thing might have been made of one piece, There's also a chance that the mail was in a coif form, which is quite common, in later medieval times, in the 13th century, for example. But how it was worn? Well, some people suggest also, why do we not see, the hem of the mail on some of the sources from this time? Well, it might be that the coif is worn first, and then you put the mail on afterwards, and that would secure the mail in place. Sometimes maybe it was worn on top, or maybe all these different methods were used. There's also some confusion. When you look at the Bayeux tapestry, there's a square of mail, seemingly possibly a reinforcement. It looks like there's 4 rivets and maybe a bit of reinforcement leather on the mail, on the chest, where the vulnerable, vital organs are, maybe. Or maybe it's just a mail ventail, a piece of mail from the face that's dropped down most of the time. You don't wear it up. This mail coif here has a ventail, for example, integral to it. And unlike what we see on the Bayeux tapestry, or what's suggested by the Bayeux tapestry, it's not, dropped down on both sides. It's just like a triangular mail, really, that's wrapped around the face and maybe tied around the left ear in this case, for example. And there you'd only see the eyes. Maybe it was worn over the helmet, maybe it was worn under the helmet. There's all sorts of things that we just don't know, but it's interesting to speculate. And maybe there's regional variations, or maybe there's class variations. It's such a stratified society. Linen here, of course, grotty old linen. No one else wants to wear that, I bet. As for the mail links, they're made of iron. In the Viking and Norman time, the rivets seem to always made of iron, but in earlier times they were often made of copper alloy, such as at Sutton Hoo. The Saxon ones were often made of copper alloy. The mail itself, as I say, is iron. A lot of work in making these mail shirts. They're very expensive items. A mail shirt, according to Carolingian texts, I don't have a price for it in the Viking Age, was 12 cows, 12 heads of cattle. So that's a lot of money. I'll give you some comparisons. You can buy a shield and a spear together for 1 cow. So in other words, this mail shirt is worth 12 spears and 12 shields. That's what it's worth. So quite rare, probably just worn by the upper echelons in particular, It's possible that some of the better armed infantry would have been armed with, shorter mail shirts, or ones with shorter sleeves, some sort of compromise from a financial point of view made with them. And it's because of this riveting that they took a long time to make, as well as, of course, the amount of iron involved, So the price was very prohibitive for most people in society. Later on in Irish history, and again this is bonus material, the gallo glasses, the guys wielding these type 2 and type 3 axes, this was their standard armour. They all had it, and they would have worn padded armour underneath. Now, for padded armour is a real problem when it comes to the Viking Age. We've no evidence for it at all. None. There's not a scrap of it from the Viking archaeological record. There is a small bit of padded deerskin armour from Dublin that was found in Corn Market. That's probably 12th century, around the time of the Norman invasion, maybe 1170, 1180, around that time. So that's really cool. And maybe some of the last Vikings also had some of this organic armour. Deerskin armour is mentioned in, I think it's the Heimskringla, in one of the sagas of the Viking kings, as a gift. I think 12 suits are given as a gift from one person to another. But that's it. There's very little reference to it. However, mail has no form of its own. So it would be necessary to wear a very thick woolen, tunic, maybe just like this, or maybe a bit thicker again, or wear 2 woolen tunics underneath it, because you need to stop the concussive effect of a blow as well as the cutting effect of a blow. You need to protect yourself against both, don't you, really? But there's no doubt, anyway, that by the time we get to the Normans, in Ireland, and certainly, I'm pretty sure the Normans in England too in 1066, but 100 years later when they come to Ireland in 1169, 1170, that you would have had padded garments like this, In Irish, we call these cotunes. The French had other words for them, such as acquisition. You have gambeson, various terms. Usually, they're just stuffed with wool these days, but back in those days, the evidence, it's more like Kevlar. It's tougher stuff. You might be looking at maybe a few layers of wool in there, 10 layers of wool, interspersed with a few layers of linen. And for the nobility, there could even be a layer or 2 of silk in the mix as well, maybe on the outside to show your wealth. And it's the combination of those materials that would have given you, really good protection. And often these ones, they were so well made that they would have been better than the mail on its own, and used with the mail, you're more or less bulletproof at the time, I guess. The ties at the front are made of deerskin here. Deerskin, in terms of leather, has a bit more stretch than bovine leather, so we often use it for ties for that reason. There's no eyeglets. Now, eyeglets are little bronze ferules that we get at the end of these, but there's no evidence for eyeglets anywhere in Europe that I've seen from before 1250. So for our Normans, I can't add the eyelet I want to add here. I can't do that, So what we have here is just a bare leather, and the leather is tapered and cut, so it fits easily enough through the holes. But later on, within a few generations of the Normans, we'll have these ferules made of rolled brass sheet, which are very handy. Sometimes there's rivets in them as well, by the way. And that's how you stitch it up at the front. Because it's made of linen and wool and textile, there's a danger, of course, that if it gets wet, it'll get very heavy. And there's a danger you'll get pneumonia or some other horrible disease because you're damp. So I think it would have been necessary to wax these for campaigning soldiers, just like your Barber jacket today. I hate to give a brand name, but I'm talking about something it's useful. And just a bit of beeswax, giving you a sheen, and the water would roll off. I think that's what they would have had to do with these. I don't see anyone going around with a pure white one unless they work indoors for some reason. Lucky Sentry, he gets to work indoors. The fit on these gambesons, cotunes, acquisitions is very well fitted, often quite waisted, a bit like your Bruegel clothing later on. There's a real look to medieval clothes, and they're often very well fitted, especially from the 15th century onwards. But you didn't have any wastage either, You weren't going to have any extra material you don't need. That's money as well, that's resources, that's encumbrance you don't need as well. So it'll be well fitted, especially if you're in the higher echelons, it'll be well tailored for you. The cuffs, of course, were narrow, so there's no material getting in your way. Some of these, when you look at evidence like the Maciejewski Bible, kind of a Polish name, but I think it's a Bible that's in Paris, in France. There's a collar of padding also, integral to it, that would have protected you beneath the coif for the neck, and that would be buttoned up. Other ways, by the way, of fastening could include buttons. Buttons could be made of scraps of linen as well, or scraps of material to button it up, but the deerskin is probably a bit more secure. Textile could be used as well, of course, in lieu of leather. You could use linen or wool. So there's various things that have been used. Later on, by the way, we think hooks and eyes could have been used from maybe around the 14th century onwards. A lot of the effigies of Gaelic troops in Western Scotland and in Ireland, you don't see anything. You don't see any fastenings. And it's possible that that's because, the fit's way too good for it to be going over the head, by the way, if that's what you're thinking. So the fastenings seem to maybe hook in, and we do have evidence for hooks and eyes from around that time. So there's probably improvements happening everywhere, So that's the mail for you. As I say, the mail on its own, maybe 10 kilos, with the coif another 3 kilos, so there's a lot of weight even in the metal armour on its own, and even this is encumbrance. When you're wearing the mail, though, it's much easier to carry. The weight spreads out in your shoulders, and you can hitch a bit of that weight with your belt as well, so it's advisable to hitch up a bit of the mail over the belt, and that means you can still move your arms as well, otherwise your arms are just being dragged down by the mail the whole time. It's a great workout. And back in my group, Claíomh, back in the day, back in the 90s when we were all young fellas, we used to have a ritual. Anyone joining Claíomh had to wear one of these for 3 days and 3 nights without any breaks, you know, otherwise you're not in the group. 72 hours, you know. Doesn't matter what you're doing. You could be playing tiddlywinks, you could be drinking, you can be going to your insurance broker, pencil pusher job. We don't care. You got to wear that for 72 hours. Otherwise, you're not a member. So maybe we should bring it back. I don't know. Okay, so that's the body armor. I just want to go back to this here because we have a sword here. There's a little hood there. So another thing, your inclement weather. So the swords. I've one sword here, and it's the most typical of the Viking Age swords. Peterson classifies these triangular pommels with this chunky looking crossguard as the Type H, okay? So Type H in Ireland, as well as in other Scandinavian, you know, Viking Age contexts, this is the most common one found. Very, very common. Some of them are very elaborate. Some of them have incisions, and you have silver hammered in. So you can have this striped effect. It's very, very beautiful, especially with the dark iron. The grips of these swords is very short. Shorter than, you know, modern people like to think, because for example, in the modern sport of reenactment, people like to wear, you know, heavy welding gloves to protect their hands, and you're not going to get insurance without them, obviously, if you do reenactment, which I don't, not anymore. So the grip is only 8 centimeters, 9 centimeters, you know, that's a typical length of a grip, and we think the longest one on the archaeological record is 10.5 centimeters. That's all, you know. So it's very, very short, really, isn't it? There's no two-handed swords in the Viking Age. The Normans don't use them either. They do come in later, but it's 13th century at the earliest for a two-handed sword. So the two-handed axe is your man if you want a two-handed weapon. The grip here is just wood. This is just ash wood, but often they would have had pigskin as to give you extra grip on it. The suspension system on the sword, in this case, is from the Isle of Man. Now, the Isle of Man was under the control of the Dublin Vikings for much of the Viking Age, as were parts of northwestern Wales, for example. And this particular suspension system is based on a find from the Isle of Man. This one is designed to be worn either over the shoulder or around the waist as a belt. We think the Vikings did both, although over the shoulder might have been a little bit more common. Like a normal belt, it has a strap end and a buckle made of copper alloy, so very distinctive style. And there's a three-way splitter there. So unlike the Frankish one, which is solid, it's a circle, and the three parts can move quite freely, which keeps the sword nicely balanced when you're wearing it. The scabbard in this case is made of poplar wood, and it's lined with sheepskin inside. The sheepskin keeps the blade maintained because sheepskin has a natural oil in it called lanolin. Not lanolin oil. Anyone from a farming background will know what I'm talking about. The lanolin basically maintains the sword. Every time you put it away, every time you take it out, you're maintaining the blade. You're keeping it, you know, nice and clean. This one here has a little locket at the base of it called a chape, and the chape is made of copper alloy. Sometimes they're plated in silver. This one, these are very rare finds from an Irish point of view. I don't think we have any in Ireland, but we have discarded leather scabbards that have the impression of a chape, so we know they were used here. But it's just one of those things, you know, archaeologists look at the draw. We've got like almost 90 Viking swords in Ireland, but we don't have a single chape. It's just one of those things, you know. Some things we're very rich on. I mean, York doesn't have a Viking sword, and we've got 90, so we're doing okay, you know. We're doing all right. You might be wondering what the material on the outside is. Well, there's a lot of evidence that the Vikings and medieval people after them used linen as a covering for scabbards, because the poplar wood itself needs to be protected and needs to be kept together. They would have used hide glue or fish glue. There's various types of organic glues that were used back in the day, and to protect it, because hide glue, you know, is subject to unraveling with a bit of moisture, a bit of rain, in other words. So you need to protect it. So here we have beeswax, and the beeswax protects the whole scabbard. It gives it a nice finish as well, I think, you know, almost like fish scales in some respects. So this is Type H, and the dating for these ones is quite early in the Viking Age. You know, they appear around, you know, the middle of the 9th century, and they're used well into the 10th century. They're the context we're finding them in. There is a possibility, of course, that some of these may still have been used at the Battle of Clontarf as well, but they would have been regarded as old-fashioned. But that's not unusual in history. It's often in a muster even of 16th century townspeople that you hear 14th century weaponry appearing in those musters. So why not, you know? Swords were massive status items, by the way. The Carolingian texts, as I said to you, I mean, chainmail 12. So that's the most expensive thing you can own, is the hauberk of mail, or the brynie of mail, as the Vikings called it. But the sword itself was about seven heads of cattle, if you want to buy a sword in those days, okay? You could buy a slave for a lot less, let's put it that way, you know? A human life, in other words, was less than a sword. The breakdown is the interesting bit. The sword itself was only 3 of those cows. The scabbard and its suspension system was 4. It's not what you might think. I mean, I would have thought 2, 5, something like that. But what we're reading in the originals is that this is 3 and that's 4. It's incredible, isn't it? So why is that? Well, obviously the materials for making a sword, you know, steel, iron, and we know how elaborate some of the swords were made by Ulfbert and Inglery were. Well, so the materials are very expensive. We think a smith might have been able to produce 1 sword a week, for example. But perhaps scabbards, there's a lot of different materials, but not maybe one that's more expensive than what's in the sword, but just the time and the effort. It's hard to know, really, you know. And of course, there would have been variables within that as well. Some people would have had swords that were worth a lot more than the scabbard, you know, because they had a fantastic sword, you know, a very well-made one, made by one of those great brand names like Ulfbert and Inglery. They're the 2 best-known ones. Ulfbert is early, Inglery a bit later. The Ulfbert swords have been tested scientifically in recent times, and they're of incredible quality, like, you know. So while we're on the swords, I'll just show you a few more. Show you, this is the most common one, and fixate that in your mind when you think about Viking swords in Ireland, I would suggest. And you know, you can use that for your raider, you can use that for your townsman. Get this through here. So I'll just pick the swords up as I go. I'm going to do them all in chronological order now. But the sword that you saw, the H, is the middle of the Viking Age. But I'm going to show you some earlier ones. This is an earlier one. We think these ones were used before the Viking Age. And do you remember I said earlier on that our Viking Age is very much a Norwegian Viking Age when it comes to material culture, although we have a strong Danish influence too. But this is very much a Norwegian type of sword. These Norwegian swords were single-edged, you see. And we have a good collection of them in Ireland. I think there's 8 or 9 of them altogether in our collections. And they show how deep the imprint of the Norwegians was. The Danes and the Swedes didn't use this particular type, you see. The pommel is known as the Type C. So you had the Type H earlier. It's very like the Type C, isn't it? You got that triangle going on, but it's got these 2 little edges here, so it's kind of 5-sided in a way. Type C, very early, made in 1 piece. The Type H ones were often made in 2 pieces, by the way, and riveted together. Crossguard's very short, which is what you expect from an old Viking pagan sword, you know. We're not trying to advertise the cross here, are we? Like later Normans may do. The grip, as I say, could be made of pigskin. Now, the earlier grip we saw the wood, so we know what it looks like underneath. This grip is pigskin, and you have a little strand of leather here, a bit of tongue. And it may look like it's string, but it's not. It's just 1 piece of skin that's dipped in the glue, set overnight, and I use twine to wrap around it, hold it in place. You wake up next morning, maybe 24 hours later, you take that twine off, and it leaves an imprint on the pigskin, but it's all 1 piece of leather. And I've seen that on a sword that's come up relatively recently. The museum has been looking at, I think it came up about 10 years ago. I can't really remember, the years fly by way too fast now. It's probably 15 or 20 years now, God knows. But anyway, that's what we're seeing. Now, we hardly ever have a grip survive the Viking sword, but, you know, much less the pigskin than the wood. But that's what we're seeing when we do see grips intact, is this type of grip made of leather. The pommel of these swords, of course, was the counterbalance for the weight. This blade here is single edge, as I said. You can see that there. It's bright and shiny, thanks to our lanolin oil. The sheepskin, the fleece that's inside the scabbard, that's why you have it there. You won't believe the amount of TV programs I've worked on where we draw our swords nice and quietly, put them back again nice and quietly, take them out again nice and quietly, and afterwards some idiot in the special effects puts in the shing noise. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. So we get that all the time. Crazy, but that's the world we live in. It's a crazy world. We know that, don't we? Again, you have a poplar scabbard. Some scabbards are made of sycamore, but we don't have sycamore trees in Ireland, as far as we know, until the late 15th century. There you go. Great little factoid for you there. So if it is sycamore, it's imported, possibly from Scotland, because England is in the same position as us at that time as well, by the way. So right here, about 500 years, maybe 550 years. So this one is poplar wood, and again, it's wrapped in linen. And the the linen has been waxed. Now, this particular scabbard is quite faithfully copied from one from Cumbria. Cumbria, northern England, was part of the route between Dublin, the Dublin Vikings, and the Jorvik Vikings. Isle of Man being a main stopping point on the way, of course. But up in Cumbria, we have, evidence of Hiberno-Norse culture and art as well. Not an Anglo-Danish art, but much more the Hiberno-Norse. This is a sphere of influence that we call the Irish Sea area in general. It would have included southwest Scotland as well, by the way, where we saw the belt from the woman there in Claíomh, So this binding here, for example, is seen on one of the Cumbrian graves, for example, instead of a metal shape. So it's an alternative, for someone who can't afford copper alloy, or if they prefer that style, maybe they just prefer it, So it's just bound linen. And there was another piece here on the original. The top part of the scabbard I based on one from Dublin, where there was a slider preserved in the impression of a leather scabbard. We don't actually have the sliders themselves, but they are made of wood or other material. We don't know which. There's a lot of debate. Some people think they're metal. I think they're wood myself, but people disagree, and that's okay. So you put the wooden slider and you attach it to the wood of the scabbard, and then you put your outer material on, and that protects the whole thing. The whole thing is kept together then really well between the glue and the material. It's also stitched down the back, down the center. Nearly all the Viking scabbards seem to have been made that way. So some great stuff. If you're interested in Viking scabbards in particular, Esther Cameron is the book you need to get. It's got the blue cover. It's all that good old RIA, Royal Irish Academy stuff, you need to get your hands on. No idea the amount of time I've spent poring over these volumes. Social life ruined, but I know about Viking scabbards at least. Hopefully, although you never know everything, do you? So this one here looks quite posh, doesn't it? This one's also 9th century, so it's quite early as well. Peterson referred to this type of pommel and hill furniture in general as type D, and it's often, copper alloy finish on it. Very distinctive. The handle was actually decorated that way, so we wonder, did this even have a covering? Why would you cover that? Well, maybe you want a better grip, so maybe there's a misunderstanding between the maker and the user, who knows, but it's interesting to speculate. We have very few of these ones in the record in general. There was one found in Dublin, in Donnybrook. I don't know if you know the bus station in Donnybrook. That's one of the old bus stations. And I think in the 19th century, in excavations around that area, that's when they found one of these swords associated with a big mound, associated with a very high status Viking. The blade on this sword is double-edged. It's almost parallel. This is one of the big differences between Viking swords and medieval swords, is that the edges are almost parallel. The fuller on these classic Viking swords, there's a German guy called Geibig who has done a typology of the blades. He calls this type 2, so there you go. He only has 5 types, so it's not actually the minefield that some other typologies are, but type 2 is your classic Viking blade, basically, from Geibig. And the fuller in these swords occupies about 1/3 of the breadth of the blade itself. And it can run, about 2/3 or 3/4 the length of the blade, or a bit longer, actually. The blade tip, as you can see, it's not very, very pointy, the way we'd see with some later, say a Gothic German sword in the 15th century. It's very different to that. You have kind of a very convex tip there, but it's still sharp. But from the saga evidence and from the archaeological evidence itself, really, we're looking at a slashing weapon here, a very heavy slashing weapon that was used with great skill and care. It was very fast. They look very heavy, but they're well-balanced weapons. They're designed, with balance in mind. That's why the pommels are so big and chunky, and that's why the fuller's there. The fuller could help to fine-tune that balance as well. If you're looking to buy a Viking sword, back in the day, if you end up in the wormhole and you need to know, you want a bit of advice maybe, about a hand's breadth below the guard was about right. That's the sort of balance that you're looking for. And again, we've one of these sliders here. There's a few scabbards in Dublin that have slider impressions on them. So I just base my wooden sliders from the impressions of the sliders, if you know what I'm saying. And you can see how the slider retains the strap to the scabbard. This one here, you have a strap splitter as well here. So nice suspension. And literally just worn over the shoulder as so, So it's the Sam Brown of its age, isn't it, really? You can look at it that way, couldn't you? And you can see why it's designed with the 3 straps, You want that tipping forward so you can draw it when you need to do that, You will need to grip the scabbard, of course, to do that. But it comes out quite readily, I think, And again, you have the sheepskin fleece inside, There seems to be very few, there's probably leather scabbards without wood cores, but there seems to be very few exceptions, really, in what we're finding so far. A lot of them seem to be timber. This shape here, you can see the long moustache there, so that could be from the Slavic lands. Of course, Gaelic men also had long moustaches at the time. This is silver plated, so it's made of copper alloy, but silver plated. I think this one here, this particular style here is seen as far west as Germany and as far east as Smolensk in Russia. So Lovely, lovely decorative finds. And again, you got this decoration where you don't necessarily need it, you know. There's opulence, there's status everywhere, you know. So those are the 9th century swords, okay? Get the posh one. The posh one, by the way, this one, probably made in Frankland. Probably not a Scandinavian made sword, by the way, as opposed to the Langsax, the single edge one, that's probably Norwegian made. This is probably hilt furniture, blade and everything, probably, you know, German or French made, you know, and utilized by the Vikings. And again, 9th century being the date on that one, and stitched down the back. This one here, another one of these slider impressions that I've stolen from Esther Cameron's book. Hope she doesn't mind. This one's later. We're seeing a different style here, aren't we? A different type of pommel, radically different pommel. It's got kind of a knuckle guard on it, very pronounced as well. It's an 11th century style. You got your pigskin grip there, and the guards, the cross guard, kind of curves down towards the blade. This is possibly influenced from England, from the Anglo-Saxon culture. Danish Vikings, of course, are in Ireland and in England, so there's probably some, you know, transferring of ideas to do with sword hilt furniture at that time. So the crossguard there, slightly curved down. The blades also get a bit smaller in the 11th century, so we get these bigger axes, but we're getting smaller sword blades. Interesting stuff, yeah. God knows why, but this sword blade here is known as Type X. Very manageable, very quick. Maybe it's all about speed. And again, you have the wood core and the leather on top there. Buckles in the Viking Age are often made of copper alloy, as I've demonstrated earlier. I think you've seen a few of those. This is an iron one, so you get iron buckles as well. Iron would have to be protected, so when the metal's heated, you might add some beeswax or linseed to it to give it, you know, a blackening, and you might have to wax it to protect it. But it's kind of a nice, elegant little buckle, very simple, but nice and elegant in its own way. And again, you have another one of these shapes here with a raven. I think this one's from Eastern Europe. Eastern Nordic Europe, you could say. And this slider here is kind of a diamond shape on it here. And again, it retains the sword strap. This system is much simpler, and it's possible that a lot of the scabbards were just held with a simple belt that could be, you know, taken out and reused in different ways, you know. So, you know, still works, you know. It's not quite as, you know, handy in inverted commas, but it's not bad, you know. It works okay. So those are what we might call the Viking swords. Now we're going to move on the timeline a little bit, and I'm going to show you another one of Esther Cameron's scabbards. That are these have huge morphology. You get to see this pattern here, very distinctive, isn't it? 11th century, 12th century, and 13th century. We have contexts for this type of scabbard. So maybe there's a workshop in Dublin that's producing this type of scabbard over time. You know, we're not sure. You know, the scabbard is made of wood, just like the Viking ones were, and it's stitched up the back, as you can see. No shape on this one, and they may not have always had shapes, of course. The leather and the wood is quite a good combination anyway. The sword's not going to cut through there. That's not going to happen. So how's this done? This is done with leather thong in square section. And you need to glue that down onto the surface of the timber. And then, of course, you put your leather on, and you're going to have to soak that leather to death, you know, to get that sort of impression on it, you know, and then bleaches and bleaches and bleaches. This is actually my first COVID project. When COVID happened, I never prioritized my Norman stuff, to be perfectly honest with you. I'm more into Viking stuff, but I just thought this is the time. I own about 50 swords altogether myself, so it's like I'll get all the swords scabbarded, and now the swords are all scabbarded. Thanks COVID, you know, Saint COVID, the blessings of. So it's good to have a bit of time to catch up on things, I guess. The sword, I suppose you could say it imitates the sign of the cross a bit more, doesn't it? You could say that if you want. It's up to you. But I'm sure long quillins have other advantages, such as, you know, into eye sockets, etc. The pommel here is known as the Brazil nut pommel, and the blade is not all that different to a Viking blade. You know, it's broad, it's got a fuller that occupies about a third of the blade, and but it tapers down a bit more sharply than the earlier Viking one did, the Type 2, and it's known as the Type 12 by Oakeshott, who's the main man for medieval weaponry, to be perfectly honest with you. The Brazil nut pommel, as it's known, and these are very hard to date. These can be very early, back to the 11th, and they can be as late as the 15th. So the crossguard is a really hard one to date here. Type 12s are normally 12th century onwards, that sort of a date. But there's some evidence from the Winchester Bible, for example, that a sword like this was used as early as 1150, for example. or maybe 1170, at the time of our own Norman invasion here in Ireland. And there's definite evidence from Bamberg Cathedral in Germany, one of those great medieval cities and cathedrals that they have in Germany, where there's definite evidence that this sword definitely was used in 1200 anyway, which would be the second generation, I suppose you could say, of our Normans, as in William Marshall and his contemporaries. So this particular sword, by the way, is copied from one from Turin in northern Italy. But the Normans would have used swords similar to it all over Europe. It's one of my favourite patterns of a Norman sword. I think it's absolutely a gorgeous thing, to show. And I'm really glad I did a scabbard for it. It's about time, just it deserves it, in fairness, And yeah, that's the noise we should hear. Nothing. And maybe. But they take that one out and they put, So here's a much more mysterious sword. This one here was found in the River Ouse in Yorkshire. So it's a riverine find without context, so it's very hard to date it, For example, this crossguard doesn't really fit into any standard typology. The pommel is a bit like the old Viking one, isn't it? It's got that kind of lobed thing going on, and there's 5 lobes there, and you got the curvature there as well. The blade, however, is definitely a later medieval one that we'd normally think, well, that's 12th, 13th century, maybe 14th century even. It's a fantastic blade, I think. I love this design. It's very broad at the handle, but very narrow at the top, which means all the mass is close to the hand, making it really much easier to use than you might think. It's called a Cawood sword. I think it's in the Yorkshire Museum at the moment. It was back in the 60s when Oakeshott recorded it. It was in the private collection, so it's nice to see some of the swords been seen by the public a bit more. So dating for this one. The thing was that they found a second one of these swords. It was in Norway, in a place called Hedmark. And the Hedmarken sword was very similar. So similar, in fact, that Oakeshott thought the 2 swords were made by the same craftsman. The cool thing about the sword in Hedmark in Norway is that it had 2 bands on the grip which had runic statements on it, and the runes were relatively dateable. And now Oakeshott was saying, and he admits this himself, says, I used to think this was a 13th or 14th century sword. I now know it dates from 1080, that early, to just 1120. But possibly, of course, seeing service for 100 years after that. So we could say maybe 1080 up to around 1200, maybe, for this sword, maybe. Here's the addendum. The Gaelic world's always different, isn't it? And if you look at the effigies of the MacLeods, the MacDonalds, the great Helan clans of the Western Isles, you'll see swords like this on their effigies as late as the 14th century, with pommels just like that. And crossguards, not exactly like this, but often drooping down in a V shape rather than a U shape. So, again, a bit of morphology possibilities there. If that's what you're looking for, you've got it with this one. Very interesting stuff anyway, that was maintained. The pommel, in some cases, it wasn't fashionable in the 15th century, but we're seeing it in some locations. I think there's even a 2-handed sword in Copenhagen that has one of these pommels as well. So some of these Viking influences, although most people are using simple wheel pommels, some of these Viking influences still linger on longer than you might think. And certainly in effigies in England, some of the fighting men there who have their effigies, in alabaster and other materials, you see this pommel there as well, as late as that. So interesting sword. But the runic inscription is really what gives us the information about this one. So, what I was going to say one of a kind, but 2 of a kind, we can say, Lovely, lovely sword. The leather shape, by the way, is because in Derry, they found a scabbard of a sword made of linen. It's the only linen scabbard we've ever found in Ireland. And the dating is probably 13th to 14th century, around that time. So good for this, maybe, if it's kept in use for a long time. The shape, separate to the linen, is actually made of leather. So they actually have a leather shape, and we wouldn't know that. Often in illustrations, like it's just a sketch, and you just see a shape. You go, oh, that's metal, obviously. But obviously they're making leather ones too. It's kind of interesting. There's also an impression on the top of the scabbard that shows the imprint of a belt like this that was permanently attached to the scabbard, for suspension purposes. Suspension for swords from the 11th century onwards gets a lot more simple. We don't often see belt buckles anymore involved. It's often just a couple of perforations there. The belt is often integral, as in permanently attached to the sword scabbard, and used only for that purpose, it seems. So this one here, for example, for the Normans, it's always around the waist. There's no baldric system that the Vikings are using upon occasion. You have 2 perforations there, and you've got 2, the belt kind of divides into a pair, you see, so it's easy to put on. And that ties really well, by the way. It holds it really well. And like all people in World War I going backwards, the belt is worn at the waist, not what we call the waist. This is the waist, really, where your belly button is, in other words. You don't want it slipping down any lower, you know. So there you go. That's the suspension for that one, the K-wood sword. And yeah, this is the type of sword I think may also have been used around the time the Normans came to Ireland by both sides. You know, you might have had swords, especially in Viking Dublin. I can see the Viking Dubliners using swords like this, you know, when they fought against them. I don't know how much you know about the Battle of Dublin that happened, but basically the Normans arrived, I think it was around September of 1170. Lawrence O'Toole tried to do some negotiations. The Normans were listening for a bit, but some of the Normans weren't having it and broke into the west sides of the town. Not Strongbow himself, by the way. He was still in the negotiations when this was going on. So we don't know whether it was by design or by accident, just a lack of discipline. You know, the usual Cromwellian excuse, oh, I lost control, it's not my fault. Sorry about that. Bit late now, isn't it, really? But yeah, some of the knights broke into the town, slaughtering, you know, people left, right, and centre, and the Vikings were not in the position to defend themselves under those circumstances, so they actually took flight. They went to Orkney, where they had allies up on the west coast of Scotland and the northern parts of Scotland there, and they came back a year later. I think it was May of 1171. And they came back with reinforcements as well as the core of their Dublin Viking force. And there was a battle fought called the Battle of Dublin at that time. And it was a close run thing. It's one of these battles, if the Vikings had won, we wouldn't have had a Norman history at all, maybe. Who knows, you know? It's an interesting one, you know? But you don't hear much about it, you know? But much less famous than the Battle of Clontarf, for example. But apparently what happened was, anyway, the Vikings were very well organised. And Geraldus, one of our main sources, a Welsh Norman, he comments on how the Vikings are still using the round shield, the old circular shield, as opposed to, you know, the teardrop shield used by most European cultures at that time. And he says they're coloured red, by the way. So, for some reason, you know, red's also, you know, poetically colour of aggressive intent as well, you know. But anyway, they also noted the axes, because the Normans weren't using the axe as a main, you know, frontline weapon at that time. You know, lances, yes, swords, yes, etc., but not the axe. So they comment on that. So anyway, the way the battle went was there was 3 clashes altogether, and essentially the Dublin Vikings and their allies won the first 2 clashes, but the Normans seemed to have sent a second force around the back and did kind of a pincer movement a bit. You know, von Manstein, I hate to take you to 1943, but it's what I think of when I think of the Normans doing this type of manoeuvre. And the Vikings were routed, you know. One of their big champions went down, a guy called John de Woad, probably a guy who was tattooed from his neck down to his fingertips, you know. When he went down, possibly with 2 Normans in his hands, but he went down, the other guys cracked. Hasculf MacTorcal was the last Viking king of Dublin. He was taken alive. He was captured, you know. And the Normans, of course, would have been using the old wooden Parliament building on Parliament Street in Dublin as their main HQ at that time, or around that area at least. And they brought Hasculf down to the Parliament building going, you might remember this place, Hasculf, from last year, right? Yeah. And I think it was Miles de Cogan who was the leader then, because Strongbow had a bit of business in Wales to take care of at that time. And de Cogan says to him, put up a good fight there, you know. I'm just paraphrasing, obviously, but if you want to walk away with your life, you can, but you have to promise never to come back again. And apparently Hasculf MacTorcal, final Viking king of Dublin, couldn't make that promise. Just couldn't do it. Couldn't tell a lie. He's like, no, let me go, I come back, blah, 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 I take my town back. So he was executed anyway in the hall. I think it was by beheading. Interesting thing in Dublin is that the mayor has many subtitles, and one of the subtitles that the mayor has, because the mayor title came in with the Normans, one of the subtitles they have is Viking King of Dublin to this day. They don't use it anymore because they're way too boring for that, you know. But Viking King of Dublin officially is still one of the subheadings, because they're always afraid of another Viking uprising. And if you look around popular culture these days, well, I can see where they're coming from, you know. So I'm just going to show you a few more bits and pieces to wrap up. This one here is a medieval sword, just to show you how swords go after the 12th century. Certainly this one here normally would get a 13th century date from a lot of people, by the way. But this is your classic medieval sword. This is what the museum would refer to as a knightly sword, for want of a better word. And yeah, it is one for a better word, isn't it, really? One of the reasons I brought this along today is because we're in County Westmeath, and this sword is based on a find from Derry Moor, which is a townland in the county. It was found, I think, in the 19th century. Some lucky young kid was just walking by a hedge, oh, there's a sword, and it's in the National Museum ever since. The main difference is that the quillins are slightly longer. Besides that, this is more or less a replica of that sword. And it just shows how swords develop. And these wheel pommels are de rigueur, you know, for medieval swords throughout the period in most European countries. We can get into the nuances of Irish medieval swords in another juncture, by the way. I do that too, you'd be glad to hear. The grip there made of timber. You have that wheel pommel there. And I can't wait to show you some Scottish ones and Irish ones to show you what the differences are. But anyway, that's your standard medieval sword. This scabbard here is very closely modelled on the one from County Derry. I think it's from the foil, and or maybe the ban. But anyway, you can see how long it is, quite long, and stitched up the back is the way I did it in this case. So pretty cool. And as always, in the medieval time, around the 12th, 13th, 14th century, it's integral. But sometimes you will get a metal closure. An alternative weapon that we often hear about but don't see much of is the mace. Now, this is not going to look as impressive as your Nazgul mace, you know, but which is really impressive. And some of the later maces from northern Italy and southern Germany are incredible weapons. This here is what the Normans would have had at the time of the invasion in Ireland. It's a copper alloy. It still has flanges on it that would have caused a lot of damage, but it's all about weight, you know. It's a bit like a trench club in World War I, isn't it, really? I'm sure the World War I trench clubs were modelled on these weapons. This is the sort of weapon you need when your sword cannot break through that armour, you know, which is going to be quite likely, isn't it, some of the time, if you're up against a well-armoured foe. So to fight someone, if you're in the top 1% and you're fighting someone else in the top 1%, this is what you need to have. There's no surviving haft for these weapons that I know of in Ireland, so I just put a hole in there because I thought there might be a lanyard or a leather thong that might have been used to ensure that you keep the hell, because it's not, there's no finesse to this, you know. This is going to fly right out of your hand, you know. But anyway, just thought I'd show that as a contrast with the swords. It's the sort of weapon that every Norman knight probably had to bring just in case, you know, in inverted commas. Just a few small Norman artefacts that we'll bring to the camera just to show close. The Normans had their own version of the brooch. The penannular brooch is really out of fashion at this style, and during Norman times, the annular brooch, the full circle, was used. You had to actually drag the material into the circle and then put the pin through it. So it's actually more difficult to use in some ways. I think this one has the Latin legend, "Love conquers all." Isn't that nice? Weren't the Normans so cuddly? This one here is quite small. We find a lot of these on the archaeological record as well. And they might have been just worn as a badge, little badge, you know, little memento. But they could also have been used to, you know, hold your kirtle together, or your tunic, you know, your skewered, whatever you want to call it. Then the coins. There's a couple of coins here. I brought one for that rogue, John de Courcy. John de Courcy was a Norman who did a solo run. Carrickfergus Castle is his base of power. He fought the O'Neills. He allied with the Isle of Man, you know, people of Viking descent. He didn't want to pay any tax to King John. He was, you know, so he might be the sort of Norman you might like if you don't like Normans. In the end, he had to beg O'Neill for assistance, and O'Neill was like, "You joking me, by?" I don't think he used a Galway accent, but you know what I mean. This one here is really cool. This is King John's coin from King John minted coins in Waterford, in Dublin, of course. I think there was at least 4 people minting coins in Dublin, and there was 2 in Limerick as well. And this is one of the Limerick coins, by the way. So Limerick's very proud of that. On one side of the coin we have a triangle, and the triangle has the king's head on it, and the king faces us, you know, with his flaxen locks dangly down, just like Mozart's, you know. He looks very, very nice and regal. And on the other side of the coin, there's the symbology of the sun, the moon, and the stars. Little message from King John. See everything underneath it? I rule that. That's basically the message, I guess, from King John. If you're wondering who King John is, he's the one from, well, if he ever existed, Robin Hood's time, you know. So if you're a fan of Will Scarlet and Little John and Maid Marian, you're not going to be a fan of this fella. He has a pretty dark reputation, in fairness, even in England. Although apparently the people in Limerick called him Good King John because he gave them a charter. Yeah.
He also commissioned this castle here.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
And Ringoon, yes. So we're not complaining about King John too much.
And Dublin Castle too, isn't that right? Yeah. That's it. Oh, another thing here. Spoon. So this one is from the same period, 12th century, and it's made of horn. And if you're wondering how these are made, you steam them with heat, and when it gets hot, it can be manipulated any way you want. You can press it out and make a nice little groove there to use shallow little pitting. And the point there, I think that might be on purpose. That could be your skewer. Yeah, exactly. So it's all in one, in other words, you know. Lovely little thing anyway. Just a nice little artifact. I don't collect a lot of Norman stuff, to be honest with you. For every 10 Viking events I do, including schools and educational events, I get one Norman. So I've never really gone to Normans too much, but I'm interested in Normans because they kind of bookend our Viking age, which I hope is what you're getting from this talk today. So I think that's most of it. I think I should mention maybe just the helmet here, and all the helmets actually. Viking. We used to think they were earlier, but the date on this is about 970, 980, around that time. So it's later than you might think. So definitely suitable for Clontarf. Spectacle guard on it, based on a find from Drummumbu. It's the only really definitive Viking helmet found so far. There's one in England, but the context is not really there, to be honest with you. So there's some debate around it. The spectacle guard seems to be a Scandinavian speciality, really. Blackening again, a bit like some of the other iron items we've seen, is with beeswax, with heat, just to give some protection from rusting. In the Drummumbu grave, there was the remains of a full mail shirt, a short one, a Viking style one. And there was a few scraps of mail, and I mean literally 4 or 5 links near the helmet itself. So there could have been a whole curtain of mail around the helmet like this, or there may have just been a curtain of mail around the back or to the front. We just don't know, Your guess is as good as mine, but I think it looks pretty good with the full curtain, and it gives me a bit of anonymity for certain events, so I want anonymity. This one here is our typical European helmet of the Viking Age, I would suggest to you. The original, and it's a very rare original, these 4-piece helmets, and the Drummumbu is the same, 4 pieces of iron. These are really rare in the record, like really, really rare. And the one in New York, I think there's one other one in Europe, and that's it. The Metropolitan Museum in New York gives us an 11th century, 12th century type of date, but I'm pretty sure these could have been used in the 10th century as well. The Bayeux Tapestry shows us other helmets a bit like them, but they got reinforcement bands, and they're often seen with reenactors, but there's just no archaeological evidence for them at all. So I feel a lot safer with this one, with the 2 plates overlapping the 2 side plates. I think that works a lot better for me, and I think these were given fidelity to the record. We just don't know what artisans like the Bayeux Tapestry weaver really intend in their illustration sometimes, but they're interesting sources nevertheless. The nasal guard would come down as far as the mouth to give you pretty good protection to the face. You still have pretty good vision. The Drummumbu helmet is not bad either. There's pretty good vision. It's a much wider lens than you're dealing with Gothic armour of the 15th century, for example. The mail here you see is very fine. It's just about 6 mil diameter. And again, you have the rivets. Sometimes every second strand was made of punched links, so you didn't have to do as much riveting, and that was also good for strength. So often the mail was of very fine size. Roman mail could be as small as 4 mil, by the way, so it was sometimes even finer on the Lorica Hamata, as it was known. And then you have this one. If you're doing a long shift, this is the one you want. It's made of 1 piece of iron. It's a massive breakthrough in metallurgy, There's a fair few of these in Europe actually on the record, maybe 10, 15, maybe a few more. It depends what you want to include and what you don't want to include. Some genius has worked out a way of banging a helmet out of 1 piece of iron. That's what's represented here. Quite incredible. So this helmet's probably going to cost you 10 times the cost of that one, because if you can make that, you can really charge for that, But it's lighter, and because it doesn't have, overlaying metal, it also has the benefit of being stronger, theoretically. You have a hook there as well, and the hook could have been used in conjunction with something like our vent tail on the Claíomh. Do you remember the Claíomh from earlier? Seems a long time ago now. And that could be held up with the edge of the hook. We don't know what the hook is for, but that's just one idea of how it could have been used, But certainly on 1 or 2 or 3 of those helmets, such as one in Augsburg, one from Orchowski Lake in Poland, where this one's based on, you have these hooks as part of the design. You have, obviously, leather straps to hold it in place. Sometimes there's no buckle. Sometimes there was no straps, Sometimes medieval helmets were just so well fitted you didn't need straps, That's the way it appears, although, you're better off having straps now if you want to keep it on. This is a great helmet for showing you the inside of the helmet. If it was World War II, this whole interior would be leather, wouldn't it? You have a leather spider for your M42 and your Brodie helmets and all these things. But for this one here, what you have is you have a leather band that's riveted to the brow, and that's what those holes are really for, And then stitched to the leather band, you have these triangles, these linen triangles that are stuffed with wool. Now the reason we know they're like this is because about 10 helmets from Europe altogether have parts of their interiors intact, you know. And we imagine the Viking helmets were similar in how they did things. So that's why we do it this way. There can be 6 triangles, there can be 4 triangles, there can be 8, you know, but either way, that's roughly how it would look in all these helmets with all sorts of variations. So I'll show you this one as well, just to show you a different one. So you can see which one I wear the most, can't you? Yeah, I know. I told you, I'm not a big Norman guy at all. But anyway, yeah, it's getting grotty. But it adds to the look, doesn't it? That's what people expect to see, isn't it? Along with swords going shing. Yeah, right. I'll put that one back there. Now, I included this one because if we were strict, we wouldn't bring this one to an event that ends at 1180. But the earliest date for these ones is about 1190. 1190, so maybe the second generation of Normans. Certainly William Marshall would have had access to armour like this. It's not necessarily a better design than the earlier ones. The earlier ones have better deflection, for example. But it is possible that these ones were worn over smaller skull caps of metal as well. So maybe that wasn't such a big issue. But certainly after these helmets came out, the helmets that succeed them, known as great helmets, and there's quite a few of them on the record, about 7 or 8 on the European record, they do taper again back to look that's a bit more like that. Not exactly like that, but a bit more like that. So just give you some, you know, nerdy dates. The face guard, you could say 1190, the top 1190. This rear piece, 1205 maybe, so it's a bit later that we see these. You know, this is the classic, you know, Crusader helmet, I think, in people's minds, isn't it really? There's one really good effigy in Hospital in Limerick. The hospital is a small village in Limerick, but they're named after the Hospitallers, of course, you know, and they're one of the knightly orders. And they have an effigy, a 3D effigy, the only one I know of that has one of these helmets represented. There is also a 2D effigy called the Brethren. It's of 2 knights on 1 slab in Jerepoint Abbey that also shows this type of helmet. Now the problem with both of these effigies, the one in Limerick and the one in Jerepoint, is from our Norman invasion point of view, and even the William Marshall point of view, they're too late. They're around 1250, 1260, around that sort of date, you know. If you want to learn more about them, I've got a book coming out soon. Yeah, well, basically there's a book coming out called The Crusade, coming out really soon, edited by Tygo Keefe and Paul Duffy, and I just wrote a chapter ostensibly about how, you know, the Crusaders had crossed legs in their effigies and why that was, and blah blah blah, and you know, I gave you my inconclusive ideas in that essay. But I also discussed some of the armour. I had to survey all these effigies to have a look at that stuff. So that's coming out in September, so it's out in a month. Yeah, be worth a look, you know. So another big problem with this one is we have dash 1 of, we have dash 2 of maybe, we have this maybe 15 of, we have 0 one of these. We have none of these on the archaeological record, so we are relying on the effigies, you know. So it's interesting just to look at them. They're so important, you know, sculpture is so important in our study of this 12th, 13th century period of armour. This one weighs a ton, by the way, and I just carry the chainmail. I hardly ever bring it anywhere, but just thought you might like to have a look at it. Knives for fighting. We have one. So you have the small knife around your neck, maybe at your belt if you're a 9th century Viking, maybe at your belt if you're a Norman, who cares. This is a fighting knife. Now, it's got a really elaborate scabbard, really elaborate sheath, more elaborate than any of the sword scabbards that we've seen so far today. Why is that? Well, Kim Hjarðar and Vegard Vika, 2 guys who wrote a book called Vikinga Krieg, which is Vikings at War. It's been translated into English, you'll be glad to hear. So it's a great book, by the way. It's got all those colouredy pictures and it's got all the sourcing all in one book. You usually get one or the other, you don't get both. In that book, they put forward an idea that these scabbards, being so elaborate, were probably awarded to men in the way that you might, you know, get an award as a medal in the modern army, you know. I like the way how you supported me at Hafrsfjord. I give you this now. Yeah, there might be a ritual that went with it, you know, lost to us now. This is a great example, of course, of that eye and dot patterning. Do you remember that? I was telling you about that one. So you have the dot in the center and you have the circle around it, which often identifies Viking artifacts. The blade is carbon steel edge, but it's in a sandwich. There's iron on both sides, do you get me? So when you shave it down, you can just about see the different coloration between steel and iron in that section there. This grip is based on one of the grips, I think, from Novgorod in Russia, where the Swedish Vikings were kind of colonizing at that time. And lovely, lovely grip. I think there's one like it in Coppergate in York also, by the way. And you have a lanyard here as well, which is speculative, but it's quite likely they may have had one of those to retain it. One of the interesting things about these knives, or saxes as they're called, is that in the iconography of the time, and there's not much of it, but in the iconography they're seen worn like this, and the sword is to the side, right? But I've worn it like this, and I don't think it's particularly useful for me to have it there, to be perfectly honest with you, you know, and that's probably putting it lightly. And I find it's much easier just to have it here beside the sword, but on top of the sword, you know, the sword's there and the two are together. But I think in iconography, of course, you want to show there's a sword, you want to show there's a knife, and that would explain, because there's going to be compromises in how you represent these weapons, isn't there? Another interesting thing is that the sharp edge is the one that's upwards. Now that's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Because think about it, if I draw this out, that edge is blunt and this one is sharp. Doesn't make sense, does it? But this is the beauty of doing living history. This is the beauty of doing experimental archaeology, is that you get to mess with this stuff once it's been reproduced. So what happens is, obviously, if you're going to take out this knife, this sax, you're going to grip the sheath first, aren't you? You're just going to just take that out. That's not going to work. You grab it, you pull it up, all done in one swift movement, of course, by an expert. I'm no expert, I can tell you. I'm a bit of a pencil pusher these days, you wouldn't believe it. And that's it. So that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? Because I always wondered when I was reading about this stuff first, why would that be? And it all makes sense, doesn't it, really? Now, these elaborate fittings are from Gotland. There's also elaborate ones from Birka. In Ireland, we don't have the remains, you know, of the copper alloy elements in any great numbers, at least, only tiny little bits, maybe one of these little U-shaped clamps, for example. But what we do have is the leather. So the leather here, see that pattern there? That's actually modelled on a Dublin one. And in Gotland, they don't have the leather. So this is kind of a Frankenstein. You know, instead of speculating altogether, I'm using elements from across the Viking world to put together a whole reproduction. So, you know, it's reproducing something, but yeah, there's a few grandparents involved here, not just one direct line. We mentioned earlier on about the nameless Norwegian, who was a famous example of using the broadaxe. There's not very many famous examples of people using the sax or the short knife as their main weapon, but one example is Grettir. Grettir was an outlaw in Iceland, and he has his own saga, well worth a look. It's a pretty vulgar saga, so it's not really a family story. And one of the raisons d'etre for putting this saga together was from a Christian community, recently enough Christianized, trying to show what a bad pagan Viking looked like, you know. Anyway, Grettir had a big body count by the time they finally took him down, you know, with a colossal number of people. And yeah, he's the guy who comes to mind when it comes to that weapon. I would point out, yeah, that the sax would have been useful in a battle like Clontarf, when you're up close to someone. When you're too close to swing a sword, yes, you can use the pommel to knock them, and the shield, of course, is another way that you could attack people, but a short knife like this would have been very useful in that regard. So it wasn't just for show. And possibly that knife was allowed into your local tavern when your sword and your axe were not. And that's this shield here. So we've got two shields. We've got the Norman, obviously, and the Viking shield. So I just thought we'd do a bit of detail on the shield. Shield size is between 80 centimeters and 95. That's what we find on the record across the Scandinavian world. Not very many intact ones. They're made of very thin wood. In Viking duels called halmgangs, they didn't last long, so therefore they gave each man 3 shields. The 13th warrior is actually right about that particular detail, would you believe? The centre of the shield is only a centimetre thick from what we're finding on the archaeological record, and the edge could be as thin as just half a centimetre. So it tapers out to just, you know, 5 millimetres, that's all, okay? So you thin it out. It's made of planks. Usually it's made up between maybe, say, 8, 9, 10, 11 planks altogether. And the long handle, usually made of wood, but we have a copper alloy one in the Dublin Museum, helped to reinforce those planks. Everything held together with organic glue, of course. Now, the front and the back were usually covered with material. Certainly the front was covered with material, and often the back as well, we think. It's only when you use these shields for funerary purposes, such as at Gokstad, that you wouldn't bother with all those organic materials. Here we have linen, for example. I've only started beeswaxing, needs a bit more work, doesn't it? And at the front, we have pigskin. Now, you could use any light leather, but you need to use a thin, light leather that's not going to weigh too much, because weight is obviously an issue with this type of protection. So pigskin is very strong and it's very thin. The paint came from natural pigment, so white could be extracted from what's called calcium carbonate, which is chalk, or you could use gypsum. Gypsum is a more common alternative to chalk in Mediterranean parts of Europe, for example, where it's more frequently come across. You could also use bone ash, that's burnt bone. Burnt bone, ground it with the pestle and the mortar, and you would have the pigment for white from that as well. So there's various ways through natural means, and others as well I'm not going to mention here. Black, I think we mentioned black a couple of times, with charcoal and with ground with lamp black as well, the residue, you know, from your candle, from your tallow candle. Red could be achieved through various means. Red ochre is actually quite rare in nature in these parts of the world. You get more commonly in Africa, but yellow ochre is fairly common in nature, you know, in Ireland and Britain. And if you burn yellow ochre, you get red ochre. So if you have yellow, you got both, in other words. So it's a great resource in a way. This pattern on this shield is modelled on the only pattern that I think is legitimate for an Irish Viking. I'll explain. First of all, no pattern of a shield has survived in Ireland at all. There's none in Waterford, none in Dublin, and if there's any in Limerick, they're not telling us about it, you know. So this one here is based in Isle of Man, which, as I said earlier on, Isle of Man often served as a satellite of a little, I suppose you could call it a little Dublin Viking empire at that time, you know. And a small scrap of leather, don't know what species, survived in the excavation that was done in 1946 of this particular grave of a single Viking called Balater. And on that scrap you see this pattern, literally a bit of white, bit of black, and then this piece of linear design in the centre, where you have white stripes, black stripes alternately, and you have red beading in between two of the lines of white stripes. So it's very distinctive looking. If you're into Viking art, you may know that we're looking at Mammon art here. Mammon art is that beaded art where you have dots running through the lines. The Mammon axe is the most famous artefact represented from it. It's a black hand axe with a beautiful silver inlay. So that's where I got the pattern from, and it's tempting, of course, as an Irish person to think, oh yeah, well maybe some more Dublin Vikings had that, but of course there's a lot of individuality in the Viking age, especially in the early period, and probably a personal choice, you know, just like your Scottish tars and your tartans later on, you know. So certainly there was Viking uniform shields used by Christian Viking armies, such as Olaf at Stiklestad. His Christian army, the Norwegian army at that time invading Sweden, had crosses on their shields, but even then there was probably a lot of variation between them. I bet you it wasn't just one guy making all the shields, you know. Probably just throw paint, get your shield painted up, you know, get on with it. Even look at World War II or even World War I German helmets. They were given instructions as to how to paint the helmets, but they all look different. There's no two the same. Yeah. So that's what I love about this sort of history, you know. The boss in the centre is very distinctive, isn't it? It's pointed, you'll notice, yeah? And if you know much about the Vikings, you'll know that the typical boss looks like this, isn't that right? Yeah. It's hemispherical. Sometimes there's a gutter, and the larger the gutter, the earlier the boss, by the way. And these are used throughout the Viking Age, like from the very earliest times till the end of the Viking Age. And as Geraldus tells us, Dublin Vikings are still using this in the last battle the Vikings ever fight in Ireland in 1171, which is really interesting, I think, from a world Viking point of view and everything else point of view. So this pointy one, what the hell's going on there? Well, I would say first and foremost, I think both bosses are unpleasant. If you take one in the nose, it's going to break your nose. If you take one in the teeth, it's going to smash your teeth in. So I don't think it's that more aggressive than the round one, because we know they were used aggressively from saga literature. But it's a cultural marker that we see around this Irish Sea area. And they don't all look the same. Some are a little bit more shallow, some are a bit more extended, some have a wider flange, for example. Some have 5 rivets, some have 6 rivets, some have 4 rivets. Sometimes the rivets double up and hold the handle with the nails pinned on the rear, as you see here, yeah? Does that make sense, yeah? So there's all sorts of variations with these shield bosses. But that's the Irish Sea area one, and as an Irish guy presenting to Irish audience and visitors to Ireland, that's the one I like to show people. But I like to show that one in the pocket just to show you what the baseline looks like, and by far that's the most common. These are unbelievably rare. There was one found on Fishamble Street, by the way, from the 10th century. Okay, so the rim of the shield is made of what we'd now call rawhide, so that's leather that's been, you know, you've had the epidermis removed from the front, you've had the sludgy stuff from the back, or the flesh side removed as well, and maybe it's been let out to dry for a while and pounded a bit, but it's not being tanned in the way that we know tanning. This sort of leather is prone to, you know, break down over time, but it can be very, very tough and makes ideal shield rims as well as doggy shoes, which is what it's usually used for in the modern world, you know. How are the rims applied? Well, you could use nails, you could use stitching. We don't know for sure. Most of the rims don't survive intact, and neither the nails nor the linen thread has survived, or the wool thread, whatever they're using. We just don't know, you know. But we do know that the gaps were something like 2 inches or 3 inches between each one. So when I'm making these, what I do is I soak the leather in the glue solution with water, and then I apply it to the shield with extra glue applied to the shield rim. And then I clamp it overnight So it's more or less in place without any fastenings, without any nails. And then I drill the holes, and I use the awl for that, as I think I mentioned earlier on, some of the awl. I use a small awl to make the hole, and then I use a bigger hole to open it up. And then you can put a nail through, or as I've done here, you can figure of 8 sew it, with 2 needles. That's the way to do it, and keep it really tight, Some of my friends have experimented with these a bit more in, replicating the combat of the age. And often, the linen will come off, but it's not a problem at that stage, the shield rim stays on. Also, in Sweden in particular, I noticed that some of the shields have these shield clamps found in the graves. Little, brass sheetings in a clamp shape. And they're usually nailed on, not riveted, so there's 4 nails involved. Some of the shields have up to 10 of these, but we don't see all metal rims. We don't see that at all. So maybe they're repairs, because they're not often very symmetrical where they're found. I was in the topographical files of the museum, maybe about 10 years ago. And when I was there, I came across a couple of these clamps from a crannog. And I thought, oh, that's great. We have an Irish context for these now as well. So I made up a couple of them, because when the rawhide dries, it tends to retract and gets even tighter. But that can leave a gap between 2 pieces of rawhide, you get me? So I used the clamps. I only have 2 of them here, one down there, one up here, just to fill those gaps. But it's another feature just to talk about, and I'm sure that the original Vikings would have used that, and perhaps those clamps, which we don't know what they were used for, but maybe that's one possibility, as to what they're there for. In the museum, they're just just noted as decorative, but I think they could have been functional and decorative based on what we're seeing in Birka. So that's the shield for you. It's really, really light, and what I'll do is I'll pass that around. Now, you done with the belts? Yeah, I'll take the belts and give you the shield. How's that sound? Yeah. It's really, really light. Don't forget one thing. It's not strapped to the arm like a Norman or medieval shield is. This is full arm's length. If you use it as a weapon, step through just like you would when you're using any weapon, yeah? It's also, of course, it's also protection. It's excellent protection. It's also, though, a shield to sight. So you can be carrying a weapon. No one knows exactly what the weapon is, and that can help with your next strike. That's very important. Saga references do refer to the boss constantly being used as a weapon, and yeah, it wouldn't be too comfortable going in on the skull. And even the whole shield fell apart, you might retain the boss as a knuckle duster, why not? The rim in particular is noted in saga literature as being good for winding people, hitting them hard in the lower abdomen area into the diaphragm. That's it, exactly. Sounds like you've experienced such in the past. Yeah. I am an older brother, so I just dished it out, man, that's tough. Well, maybe you need to take this away with you and sort that out, So that's the shield for you. I think they're very iconic, and I think along with the axes and ships, these are the most iconic things from the Viking Age. And it's lovely to see them reproduced, and in case you think I'm waffling, in this particular case I actually did use pigment that I mentioned. The binder was, you could use linseed oil, for example, for a binder, but linseed oil adheres, as you will know, much better to wood, so it's ideal for painting wood. But they use different ones, including egg tempera. So egg tempera is usually the egg yolk, or sometimes egg yolk mixed with egg white, can give you a nice base. And the great thing about egg yolk is that you can wash it down any way you want, and it adheres very well. I don't know if you're into Renaissance art. Maybe you've heard of Sandro Botticelli. He's one of the more famous artists who used the egg tempera. The colours don't fade. That's why his art is still as arresting and vibrant as it was, 500 or 600 years ago. Incredible stuff, Anyway, here I am talking about the Renaissance. Silly me. Finally, coats of arms were brought into Ireland by the Normans. So they're not always miserable as you think. Coats of arms are nice things, aren't they? The Vikings, we don't think they had them. Although probably there was individuals with, symbols on their shields, and that's me, and my son will wear this as well. Maybe he'll have his own mind about it, But certainly, heraldry as we know it comes in with the Normans. And the first heraldry is just for the elite. As we're back to the bikers again, aren't we? It's back to the 1%, The 1%. But kings and the highest ranking nobles. We're talking about, the Emperor of Germany, the King of France, people like that. But as time goes on, more and more nobles, of course, gained heraldry. They would have used it. But at first it probably wasn't even centralized. People probably just took on their own patterns. The initial styles are usually very simple patterns, but they get more and more complicated as they need more, styles to differentiate different families and different, subsidiaries of different families. Because of course, even in Ireland, our clans would split into septs. That's a feature of politics. It's a feature of life, as everyone who's in a family will know. This particular coat of arms is the coat of arms of the de Clare family. So that's Richard de Clare, who comes to Ireland, of course, as the leader of the Normans. And eventually, Strongbow never lived that long. He died in 1176, more or less of natural causes, after marrying the King of Leinster's daughter. So he's buying into a lot of land there, he was, obviously. And William Marshall kind of succeeded him in that role by marrying Strongbow's daughter. But the de Clare family themselves, they ended up in the west of Ireland, and you'll never guess where. Clare. You're joking me. So that, yeah, de Clare, yeah, there you go now. Luckily you're off camera for that one, you know. So that's where Clare gets its name from, you know. And there was a battle called the Battle of Dyes O'Dea, which was, I think, a big reverse. The Irish clans rose up. I think the McNamaras and the O'Briens and others had a big success over them there at that time. But that's where you get Clare from. These shields are triangular, as you can see. Now, you're probably used to seeing the Bayeux tapestry, and the shields are rounded on top, aren't they? That's the 11th century, and that goes in a bit into the 12th century. But by the time the Normans are coming to Ireland, the style is for a flatter top, sometimes completely flat, like this one here. Unlike Viking shields, you have curvature in section. It's longitudinally arranged, so the shield kind of, it's more of a defensive shield than the Viking shield, you could say, because it curves around the body, you know. You're quite competent, I guess, with your armour on and your sword and your spear. The front is linen, the back is linen in this case. The shield is strapped to the arm. There's normally 4 straps, and 2 of the straps can often crisscross as a grip. And you have 2 more to put your arm through. So this is exactly the type of shield that you would have when this castle was founded. This is the first generation Normans in Ireland shield, but unknown to the Normans in 1066. And this is about as big as the Norman shields get, by the way. They don't get much bigger than this, you know. They'll just get smaller and smaller and smaller until they arrive in that shorter, heater shape that we're used to seeing, you know, in armorials today. As you can see, rivets and washers hold the straps in place, and the rivets are iron and the washers are square, or they can be triangular as well, but they're not going to be round like the ones in Woody's. Oh, I dropped another brand name. I just can't help it, can I? They're not round, because why would you make a round washer, right? It's a lot of work, isn't it? So it's much easier just to clip one off a strip, and that's why we get square ones or triangular ones. The padding is sheepskin, but it's underneath a layer of deerskin, so that's your padding to absorb the shock of a blow coming in. Ideal for cavalry use as well as for infantry use. We think that the early Normans, especially at Hastings, were using their lances overhead, so it's not the full couched lance business going on straight away. The rim, just like the Viking shield, has reinforcement there. It's possible some of these were tapered, but unfortunately not one single 12th century shield has survived in Europe, not one. There is an early 13th century one that might be a cut down version of a 12th century shield. Do you get me? Someone who's going, well, this is very nice, but it's not very fashionable anymore. I'll cut off a bit of. So you know, that's what they're doing, and that's the von Brienza shield, which is a German-Swiss lad, and is a blue shield with a silver line. So there you go. It's a pretty cool looking one, by the way. So it's nice to have a cool one as the first one, although they all look pretty cool, to be honest with you. Heraldry and the Gale. That's a question we often get asked when we're talking about, well, we think that the O'Neill clan, for example, is using their red hand as a seal symbol from as early as the 14th century. Hugh the Fat O'Neill, not the best nickname, is the guy who gets the credit for that. And there's other evidence for Gaelic clans also use it, but it doesn't appear in the battlefield in the same way. And even with the Normans and their descendants in the 15th century, the Anglo-Irish, which is what we usually call them, although you could say Cambro-Normans, lots of things, we won't get into it. By the 15th century, the heater shield is falling out of fashion itself, and the use of battlefield heraldry is more and more reduced until the 16th century overall. But anyway, the shield, yeah, very much, and along with the Viking shield, no less than the Viking shield, for the Vikings, the Norman shield is a symbol really of the Normans in Ireland. And when I'm doing school events, great thing to do projects with children, you know, just looking at their own coat of arms, even if you're not from Europe, you know, you can look at what trade did your father's father do, you know, maybe you can include that, because a lot of the original heraldry is based on trades and little monopolies that people ran, or little businesses, you know. So there you go. That's the shield for you, and we call them kite shields normally, but as I say, it's going to soon morph into a heater shield in the time to come. We mentioned the bow earlier on in great detail. Just thought I'd mention this because I brought it. Crossbows are tricky items to own, even from a legal point of view in Ireland today, even ones like this. So what you need to do is, when you're presenting to the public, at least this is how our risk assessment goes down. You either present the gun, you don't put words in my head. You either present the crossbow or the ammunition, but you don't present both. That's how we do it, you know. So it's a tricky thing, you know. And guards prefer to legalise your Lee Enfield 10 magazine rifle than to legalise this. That's the way it is in Ireland, you know. So how does it work? Well, these early crossbows, they're not what you might think. I had a guy, I was setting up earlier on, he goes, where's the trigger? You see, crossbows change over time, as you might imagine, you know. This is a very, very early one, based on a find from France, from the 11th century. It's the sort of crossbow that a Viking might have had, and it's the sort of crossbow that early Normans would have had. And if the Picts had crossbows, their crossbows may have been similar. The wood for the crossbow, as in, when I say crossbow, I mean the bow here, needs to be similar to what you'd use for a normal bow. So it's back to the yew, the ash and the elm, those sort of woods that have a bit of, you know, elasticity in them. There's no hoof here. Do you know you'd have kind of a ring here to put your foot into, a stirrup in other words, that makes it much easier to load the string. You don't have that with these ones. Now, I could put my foot down there, but that's a really stupid thing to do, you know. So what you need to do is, you need to use both feet, right? Especially when you're on solid ground like I am. And you put the pressure on your heel while you pull it back. To do that with one foot would definitely damage the bow, you know. But to do that's how they would have done it. And again, this is stuff you can't learn from a book. This is stuff you only learn by owning one of these things and fiddling around your back garden before you turn up in front of the public and make a fool of yourself. You can see the trigger is the most simple trigger you've ever seen in your life. Look at that. You see how it works? Push that down and our string goes off. So I'll do it now anyway. The string, by the way, is made of linen, same material as the bowstring, but unlike the linen string, I haven't waxed it, which is something I really need to do, isn't it? To stop the attrition. The orangey wood there is walnut, by the way. Now, walnut is not native to Ireland at that time, so that would have been an imported one, and a bit of statement there as well, isn't it? But it's nice to have the contrast in timber colours, and it's a bit of natural world stuff for all my green fans. So I'm just going to press the button here, and you can hear the dull clunk, and imagine William Tell doing this thing. Whoa, isn't that brutal? I think that's so brutal, you know. So that's the crossbow. Imagine a battlefield full of those. Now, we've very little evidence for crossbows in Ireland, but we know they would have been used. They would have been especially useful for defending a castle like this. The crossbow would have had the range of a longbow, about 300 meters. These very powerful ones would have had at least. They take much longer to load. You're probably talking about 4 or 5 shots a minute if you're rushing, and you don't really want to be rushing really. But they're very, very accurate. And the great thing about the crossbow is that unlike the longbow, it doesn't need a lot of training. With a longbow, for accuracy, for skill and strength, it takes a lot of strength to build up the strength to use a longbow. More or less, in Henry VIII's time, for example, it's a full-time job, You're training 6 days a week, you're a longbow man. So when you lose longbow men in the French wars, it's an expensive thing to replace them, by the way, because they're very skilled people, very tough people. That's the national sport, for good reason. Crossbow, any idiot, a bit like a gun, can be learned to use one of these about 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, and you're an absolute expert, And it's very accurate as well. You just look and you push the trigger and job done. Wonderful, wonderful weapon from that point of view. It never really caught on in England the same way. The longbow served England so well, I think, during the French wars, but in Italy, Austria, southern Germany, and if you're a huntsman in any part of Europe, this is the sniper rifle of the age, because you can wait with it loaded all day long. I think I'll have a drink now. With the longbow, you're pulling that for a split second, So the crossbow was actually the best hunting tool of all. Also, in a forest, it's much easier to get around with the crossbow, so it has that advantage as well. So it's interesting to compare the two weapons. The two weapons, of course, work together in a parallel kind of way for a long time. But the bow is definitely earlier, and when we call it a longbow, by the way, people think, it's not because it's so long. It's not really. It's to distinguish it from this. This is a crossbow. The longbow is lengthwise. That's more it. Some people do ask me that what is the definition of a longbow, and it's often seen as being one that's maybe around 10 centimeters taller than your own height. So it's all arbitrary. What's a longbow for you might not be a longbow for me because I'm too tall for your longbow. Do you know what I'm saying? So it's all very arbitrary, really. It came to ahead really with the Mary Rose stuff. We've learned so much stuff from the Mary Rose stuff really, and I think Jack Pinson has a whole career based on the Mary Rose, doesn't he really? So it's all good. It's great to have these resources that we never had before. So I'm just going to leave it there. Hope you enjoyed the talk, guys. We covered I think you might agree, a fair bit of ground. The armour, the shields, swords, axes, spears, and probably a pile of other stuff I've forgotten to mention. So thanks very much for your attention, especially those who've been here for the whole time. It's great to have an audience who has an interest in this stuff, Keeps me going, that does, So thank you.